the case of Kara Enid Vaughn. Kara Enid Vaughn was a 40-year-old woman who was a diabetic on medication and had more troubles than she could share with anyone. Surrounded by family and friends, Kara Enid Vaughn still felt mostly alone in the town of Natchitoches Parish. One day, she approached her older sister, Lynn Vaughn, who was an anchor for CNN headline news at the time, and threatened to drive into the Cane River. Then in 1993, Kara left her house with only a small amount of cash. The keys to her Honda Civic got in the car and never returned. When her sister couldn't find her and her vehicle at home or anywhere else, she panicked and informed the sheriff's office that her sister had gone missing. She also reported her sister's vehicle missing. The investigators exhausted all the options they could find. Serial killers were operating near the county along the Shreveport corridor, so her sister feared that one of them might have come into town and had her sister. However, there was no way to be sure. No leads or evidence pointed in the way of any serial killer. The case, unfortunately, was getting cold. Lynn informed the police about her sister's threat to drive into the Cane River, which was south of their county. The investigation unit was unsure of where to begin, but they searched as thoroughly as they could, but nothing turned up. The years passed by and it looked like the Vaughn family would never get closure. In 2012, 19 years after Kara disappeared, her mother passed away without knowing what had happened to her daughter. Years went by and still there was no lead, no sign of Kara, and no clues to help the police move a case towards finding. Lynn Vaughn, her sister, would later say that there were times she would beg God not to let her die without knowing what had happened to the sister she had grown up with. 28 years passed by, and in March 2021, the sheriff's office got a call. It was a fisherman and he had spotted a vehicle somewhere in the Cane River. On March 12, 2021, the sheriff's office dive team searched the river, and by March 15th, the dive team along with the Calcasieu Parish Marine Unit found a Honda Civic, the same vehicle that Vaughn had reported missing. The divers got into the vehicle and were able to retrieve human remains and identification that revealed that the remains were those of Kara Vaughn. However, to be completely certain, the sheriff sent the remains for scientific tests to confirm the identity of the remains. The tests confirmed that she was indeed Kara Vaughn when the Vaughn family was notified. It was a bittersweet experience for them. Lynn, while broken by the discovery, was somehow relieved to know that her sister had since been reunited with her mother. Angela Mack Cox. Angela was born in Escondido, California, and spent most of her childhood there. Not long after she was done with middle school, her family relocated to Fulton County in Salem, Arizona. This new home was rural, communal, and set in farming country in the foothills of the Ozarks. Somehow, Angela, or Angie, as she was fondly called, adjusted to the new environment. Angie was blonde, blue-eyed, and petite at only 5'3" tall and 100 pounds. She made a tight circle of friends who would describe her as outgoing, fun, and good-spirited. Another friend said she was dramatic, loud, and much fun, and always trying to make a joke to make people laugh. Sometimes she would even pull pranks. There was hardly a dull moment around Angie. Unfortunately, while Angie had good friends, the same could not be said about the men in her life. Angela had a terrible taste in men. In Salem, she had 2 kids for her 2 exes and settled for a boyfriend who was, in a way, her husband and the only one of the 3 she didn't have a child for. The names of her 2 sons were Michael, Mikey, Ritu, and Matthew. One afternoon, Angie would vanish under mysterious circumstances in the summer of 2002. But before we get into that, let's take a look at her love life, because they are important pieces in the events that led to her disappearance. Angie's first boyfriend was Tommy Ritu, and he was the father of her first son, Michael. They had him when they were just teenagers. Tommy was known to always be in trouble, always getting arrested and hopelessly hooked on meth. However, at the very least, he did his best to be involved in his son's life. Angie's second boyfriend was Jeremy Niederbrock. They never got married, but they also had a child together, Angie's younger son, Matthew. Jeremy was considered by law enforcement to be a habitual offender who had been in and out of custody for nearly 2 decades. Between 2004 and 2019, he was arrested 9 times for felony charges that ranged from drugs to theft to domestic abuse. Angie's third boyfriend and husband was James Cox. They never had a kid together, and months before Angie would disappear, they were involved in a head-on collision that would lead to 2 fatalities. Cox was arrested and jailed due to an outstanding court warrant when the sheriff discovered he had in his possession a .22 rifle, leading to arrest for a Class B felony, possession of a firearm. This effectively made Angie a single mother with 2 toddlers to care for. From that moment up till when Angie would go missing, James Cox would remain in prison. Angie and her oldest son vanished from a town 40 miles northeast of where she lived most of her life. Both towns were small and rural. Alton had a population of roughly 840 people with only 350 households. Salem, on the other hand, was slightly bigger with 1,600 people. It was Tommy Redtooth, Mikey's dad, who reported his son missing to Fulton County authorities a day after their disappearance. Sheriff of the county, Albert Al Rohr, took the information and filed a missing persons report for the 4-year-old. Mickey was described as a 4-year-old boy standing at 3 foot tall with light brown hair and brown eyes who weighed between 40 and 50 pounds. But Angie, who was well known in nearby Salem, Arkansas, would vanish into thin air without a report, an inquiry, or any official notice about her whereabouts. It wasn't until nearly 2 years later, in May 2004, that her mother, Lorna Poole, reported her missing to authorities. Nearly 2 full years after the sheriff received information about Mickey, his office filed an official missing persons report for Angela Mack. The sheriff's office gave the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, NAMUS, Angie's identifying information. But the photo they supplied was not Angie, rather a woman peripherally tied to Michael's father named Holly Markham Brackett. The sheriff stated he was not the individual who submitted the wrong photo. While it is not strange to delay searching for a missing adult, in this situation, the circumstances should have thrown up a few red flags for the sheriff's department. Mothers, especially sole caregivers, rarely abandon their young children. However, the fact that Angie's mother also didn't report her missing also complicated matters further and made the search for Angie's whereabouts a lot harder for the case. Thankfully, a new investigator in the sheriff's department was eventually assigned to Angie's case. Dale Weaver was a seasoned law enforcement professional who knew Fulton County well, and he began seeking new leads for the cold case in 2020. Several theories sprung up about what might have happened to the 4-year-old and his mother. Some were bizarre, like Angie trading her son for a bus ticket, while others seemed to be the likely cause. It was believed by some that he was murdered the same night Angie vanished. However, no one was able to say what exactly happened. In the meantime, and while Angie's husband was still in prison, her second boyfriend or someone pretending to be him got on the Charlie Project website and posted wild suggestions as to her disappearance. He said, "Rumor is Angie overdosed and the group she was with buried her body on top of a grave on a property in Arkansas. Sheriff Al Rourke has never taken it seriously. Mikey was supposedly being taken care of by someone else, and she never returned and they never turned him over." Another person, a friend of Angie called Rachel Deanne, also posted something similar, but on a different website. She said, "The confession I heard was that she was buried near the property or on the property where the Buchanan shooting happened. I tried calling state police and everyone was putting it on my Facebook at the time I found out. I knew Angie in 1999. I was married to the guy who confessed." The truth of these claims could not be verified because there were no leads and the police were either stalling or something more sinister. However, it still looked like the police were folding their arms on the issue. Angie's first boyfriend, Tommy Redtooth, who reported his son missing, sadly died after being arrested following a traffic stop. He had gotten into a physical scuffle with the police during his arrest. After being placed in a holding cell, he told another inmate he swallowed 2 grams of black tar heroin and 8 grams of methamphetamine. Tommy would complain of leg pain, become lethargic before vomiting and convulsing. He died later that night, after being transported to a nearby hospital by jail staff. An investigation into Redtooth's death indicated he was left in a cell without being checked on for an hour and a half. Jail staff believed him to be detoxing and were distracted by another inmate who committed suicide. Concerning suspicions about his involvement with Angie's disappearance, Redtooth was cleared by the investigation team. It was also very unlikely that he would kill Angie and his son since he didn't have any history of that behavior. He was on very good terms with Angie before her disappearance and had unlimited access to a son whose life he was heavily involved in. Years passed. Investigation stalled and the case went cold until October 2020. Nam Hughes was able to discover that Angie had left Mickey with a couple who lived in Alton, Missouri, a few weeks before her disappearance in September 2002. It was also discovered that she wanted the couple to adopt Mickey, and they had agreed before Angie left for California. However, Angie changed her mind and bought a bus ticket for Springfield, Missouri to come to collect her son. She was picked up from the bus station by at least one of the couples involved in the adoption and taken to the residence. This was where the trail stopped for Angie. This was also the first considerable solid progress that anyone had gotten about Angie and Mickey's disappearance in years. After years of guessing and second-guessing, there was a solid lead. The FBI also got involved with the case at this point. Angie's husband, James Mack, and his brother, Jeremy Cox, both in custody, were interrogated and gave details of a couple who lived in Anton where she had gone to give up her child for adoption. Was James Cox in on it also? The couple was a man named Clarence Cruz and his wife, Barbara Cruzan. They were in the process of adopting Mickey when Angie changed her mind. At the time, the police came in contact with the couple. Clarence was already dead, having been shot to death mysteriously in a county called Laredo. Barbara confirmed a few details. First, they picked Angie up from the bus station where she changed her mind. She also said that her husband saw Angie off. Angie's mom, Lorna Poole, had called her husband at the time and they told her that her brother had come to pick her up. But that was a lie. Angie's mother knew that was a lie because Jeremy was in jail at the time for theft. As Barbara Cruzan began to spin a complex web of lies, investigator Dale Weaver quickly came to realize that Barbara and her deceased husband were the last people to see Angie alive. Weaver requested that the FBI run a polygraph test on Barbara Cruzan on the 2nd of April 2021. As investigators predicted, she failed the test woefully. After this, Barbara spilled the whole truth about what had really happened to Angie and Mickey. She said her husband had murdered both Angie and Mickey, then incinerated their bodies in a furnace on their property. On April 9th, the Fulton County Sheriff's Office confirmed that Angela Mack and Michael Ritu were the victims of murder. A case that had stretched for almost 20 years was finally solved. However, there were still so many questions to be answered. Why did Angie want to give her first son up for adoption? Did his father know about it? What's the deal with Angie's mother, Lorna Poole, and the years of silence when she could have easily solved the case? Also, why did it take that long for her to report her own daughter missing? And why did the police not take the situation more seriously before the arrival of Sergeant Dale Weaver? This case is peculiar because it raises more questions than it answers, and also because it feels more like a cover-up than a discovery. However, it seems like this case will never truly be answered, especially since it has now been declared to be solved. Barbara Tucker was the youngest of 7 siblings. She was thought of as the baby of the house, even though she grew to be taller than every one of her siblings, standing at an impressive 6 foot. Barbara was one of the most energetic and outgoing teenagers you would ever meet, described by her friends and family as bubbly, fun-loving, and full of energy. Barbara enjoyed playing basketball in her spare time at Cleveland High School. Barbara was also very ambitious and was willing to work hard to achieve whatever her mind set out to do. She went to a national competition, won awards, was involved in a club for students interested in business and retail, and in the summertime, she tested out her labor skills working at Sears. Then, when she was at home, she sewed, crocheted, knitted, always something that involved art and craft. At the same time, she was a sophomore studying business at Mount Hood Community College. On the afternoon of the 15th of June, 1980, and at the age of 19, Barbara was planning to go for an evening class on campus, and so she called her mother. She told her she would stop by a friend's apartment for ice cream if her evening class ended early. She was on her way to that evening class from her apartment on Northeast 23rd Street when the worst tragedy happened. The sequence of events that would lead to her demise was pieced together by the police from witness reports, and this is what they saw. A woman said she saw Barbara and a man in the woods near the campus. A couple of other people will remember seeing her frantically trying to flag down passing cars. One witness saw a man looking wide-eyed and apparently shocked emerge from the bushes in the same area. Others saw a man grab her arm and pull her off the road and into the woods near her campus. The witnesses that could get a clear glimpse of the man described him as young and in his early 20s, about 6 feet tall, with a muscular build, broad shoulders, and a square neck. He was expensively dressed in a light beige knitted ski cap, navy blue ski parka, and blue or gray pants. And he walked with a distinctive swagger, a bold, arrogant strut. No one thought to stop. Almost everyone said. They thought it was a practical joke of dodge traffic or some childish prank. The next morning, Barbara's body will be found in some shrubs near the campus parking lot by a fellow student. Barbara's parents and family, who have been waiting for her to return home, instead got to hear the news from Gresham police. It broke them. The police preserved physical evidence from the crime scene and ran through witnesses, but none of the testimonies led to anything solid. They hit multiple brick walls throughout the investigation. Days turned to months. Barbara's funeral came and went months into years, and the case went cold. Through all of this, Barbara Tucker's mother, Louise Tucker, would never lose hope. She still strongly believed that the 1980 murder of her daughter would be solved. Her father, on the other hand, was too hurt and broken to talk about his daughter, and he would leave the room whenever her name was brought into any conversation. In 1989, Albert Tucker, Barbara's father, unfortunately passed away after his death. Louise, Barbara's mother, became more relentless. She didn't stop seeking justice for her daughter, even though it looked like the case would never be solved. She stayed in contact with the Gresham Police Department and the Multnomah County District Attorney's Office. She was meticulous about every detail of the case, ensuring that nothing was glossed over and everything was considered. In 1995, 6 years after the death of her husband, Louise Tucker, Barbara's mother, also passed away. They never lived to see their daughter's case solved. However, she had left an informal handwritten record of her attempts to find answers. One of the notes said, "If it takes 10 years, I don't care. I just can't let it rest." After her death, her siblings continued where her mother left off, a desperate search for answers. For decades would pass before a break in DNA technology, which was not available at the time of the murder, would lead to the arrest of a man named Robert Plimpton of Chowdale. On the 8th of June 2021, he was taken into custody by the Gresham Police Department for the alleged rape and murder of Barbara Tucker. In 2018, a detective named Aaron Turnus had promised Barbara's sister, Susan Patter, that he wouldn't rest until he had solved the case. Physical evidence that had been taken from the crime scene years ago was what implicated Plimpton. A DNA profile match was made to him, and this was what led investigators to arrest him. Plimpton already had a sketchy history and had already been arrested once in 1997. The case was thrown out at the time, due to a lack of evidence. It was also found that Plimpton was a 16-year-old student at Reynolds High School at the time of the crime. However, the district attorney's office had said that he will be charged and tried as an adult. Plimpton pleaded not guilty in his arraignment, and his case is currently in court. Christa Luth was a friendly woman, a cat lover, and a highly educated person. She had a degree in botany and was studying for a second degree in horticulture when she broke up with her live-in boyfriend, Brad Cornea. Afterwards, she lived alone in a sublet apartment. She was also in some financial situation because her boyfriend had split the bill of the apartment with her, and now that he had moved out, the burden of the rent was slowly at her feet. She planned to sell her truck and take a part-time waitress job to make ends meet, but her father would later tell investigators that Christa told him that her boyfriend would not stop calling her after the breakup. This went on for a week or two. On the 11th of November 2008, Christa Luth spoke with a neighbor as she headed out of her apartment. She had a 6:30 p.m. to attend at a greenhouse half a mile from home. Her friend recalled that their conversation was upbeat. She never showed up to class and she was never heard from again. Her friends grew worried when they could not reach her. Her apartment door was locked. When they broke in, they found her beloved cat, Moat, inside and alone. Her living room light was on, and there was a covered pan of food on the stove as though Krista was interrupted while cooking. Her friends said it was unlikely she went to the class alone. Her father agreed, and said that she must have gone with someone she trusted. She was described by all that knew her as a reliable, responsible woman who wouldn't have abandoned her pet or left without warning. She was a very good student and planned to apply to a graduate program at Cornell University. Unsurprisingly, her ex-boyfriend, Brad Cornea, quickly became a person of interest in the case. Investigations showed that Cornea was the last person Krista called the day she vanished. All evidence also showed he was in the area of her home. Even a deputy testified that on the night of her disappearance, he had stopped to help Cornea after his truck broke down on the highway, 8 miles away from Krista's home. However, Cornea had declined and told the deputy that a tow truck was en route. Months into the investigation, police found Krista's driver's license, her debit card, and her broken cell phone at the same scene. Brad Cornea became a prime suspect, and when he was brought in for questioning, he gave the police inconsistent statements that were untruthful as to his whereabouts. Krista's disappearance was eventually declared a homicide in September 2009, and by 2014, Cornea was officially announced as a prime suspect in the case. However, her body was still missing, so it was difficult to make a strong case against Brad. Another disturbing discovery was made aside from the things mentioned earlier. It was discovered that Brad had charged in excess of $500 on her cell phone for pornography. A detective that once led the case believed without a doubt that Brad was responsible for her death, and that he also knew where he kept her body. This was the theory. Krista might have gotten into the vehicle with Brad on her way to class. The calls on Brad's phone around the time of her death supported this theory. Then Brad might have tried to mend things between them. The incessant calls over the 2 weeks leading to her death supported this claim. She most likely refused his advances. Then Krista might have said something that made Brad snap and murder her. The case went cold, and there was no way forward in sight. In 2017, Cornea was convicted for sex trafficking and using a computer to commit a crime. He was given a 16 to 40-year sentence in 2021, with Krista's body still missing and with Cornea almost 4 years into his first sentence. A warrant was issued for Cornea's arrest in connection with Krista's disappearance and presumed death. It appears the authorities got tired of waiting for the body to be found when every evidence they had pointed to him as the killer. Denise Marie Stafford. On the 13th of October, 1985, the Sarasota Police Department received calls that led them to the house of a 28-year-old mother, Denise Marie Stafford. Her husband had gotten to her home on Tarpon Avenue when he discovered her body. Their only child, a daughter who was 1 year at the time, was in another room, had not been hurt, and was alive when the police arrived. At the time, neighbors described her as a peaceful, fun-loving soul who was as kind as she was friendly. Everyone wondered who could have committed such a crime to such a beautiful woman. The police began investigations, and it was found that Denise had been killed between the late hours of the day before 11 p.m. October 12th and 3:10 a.m. October 13th. All of her items found at the scene were carefully examined in a bid to find who might have killed her that night. Investigations were slowed down by limitations in technology, and things slowly began to reach a halt. The first sign of hope, however, came when a suspect arose in the case, Joseph Magaletti Jr. He had worked as a bouncer in a now-closed lounge and restaurant that Denise and her husband, Frank Stafford, used to frequent. However, the police had nothing to nail him to the crime, and he was let go. Time passed and the case grew hold. However, in 2021, with improvements to DNA testing technology, the Sarasota Police Department decided to reopen the case. The civilian investigator, Jeff Birdwell, said that new evidence pointed to one fact. She was standing when she was attacked before being lifted and pinned to the ground. He thought about the places on her clothing the killer would have had to hold before they could do that, and sent for testing. And when the results came back, they conclusively pointed to former suspect Joseph Magaletti Jr. as the killer. Great justice. But where was Magaletti now? Oh, Magaletti had died in prison since 2015 at the age of 64, while he was serving life for strangling his former Sarasota neighbor, Another victim named Kathleen Leonard, 10 years after the Stafford murder, was a single strand of hair that led to Magaletti's arrest. But that's not all. He was also suspected but never charged with the killing of Elizabeth Zia, a 19-year-old lady who was kidnapped around Sarasota Square Mall and found dead in downtown Sarasota, a place where Elizabeth worked at the time. Joseph Magaletti would deny being involved with the killings till he died in prison. Even though the Stafford family could not get the closure they might have needed since Magaletti died in prison. Her mother, Dola Kipner, said this: "He is gone. He is not going to harm anyone else. That has been my consolation. I didn't want to see any other mother go through what our family has. She was loving, she was a good daughter, and we just all loved her and miss her." Sonia Carmen Herrick Stone in the 1970s. Sonia Carmen Herrick, mother of one child, recently divorced, moved from Quebec, Canada to Carmel, California. She got a job with Levi Strauss and worked as a sales representative. Then she got married to Michael Stone in 1976. They had a child together, but later divorced after a few years. After her divorce, she decided to stay back in California. Her life was nothing out of the ordinary up until the 15th of October, 1981, when around noon, Sonia's friend, Caroline McBride, found her friend's body. Sonia was 30 at the time of the murder and had been killed in the early morning hours of that same day. Investigations began, but McBride, who had been the first on the crime scene after the act, was not charged as a suspect. The details of her crime scene would be instrumental to finding her killer later in this account. Firstly, there were signs of forced entry and possible signs of a struggle. All indicators pointed to a robbery, but nothing valuable was missing from her house. While not too much time had passed, the case seemed to stall until a supposed witness to the crime approached with her testimony. Michelle Wilson, who was a friend to a certain Michael Glazebrook, who lived just across the street from the victim, Sonia, implicated Glazebrook by stating that he was at the scene of the murder when the crime happened. To make matters more convenient, Michael Glazebrook also happened to have a scratch on his face that he had not explained to anyone. Could it be that Sonia had scratched his face while struggling with Glazebrook? Glazebrook didn't have a criminal record at the time, only traffic warrants that he had served hearings for. McBride, on the other hand, would state that Sonia didn't know Glazebrook at all. Still, things were looking up and a lead surfaced. However, investigations would hit yet another snag when Michelle Wilson would later come to retract her testimony on the 10th of November, 1982, claiming that the passing of time had made her uncertain about the events. She also said that Glazebrook had explained to Scratch had come from an argument at a college the day after the murder. This counter-testimony appeared to snatch the oxygen out of the lungs of the case. In the trial, contradictory statements began to arise. Glazebrook's parents, Walter and Jean, testified that they hadn't seen any scratch on their son's face, and ultimately, the judge refused to rule Glazebrook as the murderer based on the fact that there was not enough evidence to tie him to the case. Subsequently, the case was dismissed. From here on, things began to get incredibly messy. Glazebrook was arrested and tried a second time. He pleaded not guilty. And for the second time, the judge threw out the case because the defendant had been questioned and arrested primarily for illegal purposes. Blood samples obtained from the suspect and statements that he made to a former FBI agent under duress was suppressed by the court, on the grounds that any evidence uncovered was fruit from a poisonous tree. The reason for this was because he had been arrested for one purpose, traffic warrants, and then was dubiously questioned for another, the murder of Sonia. Still, witnesses, neighbors approached with new information that implicated Glazebrook further. Notes like he was not home at the time of the murder. His green pickup truck was not in front of his house. Someone saw him driving away, and that scratch on his face had contradictory explanations. His explanation was the most intriguing. He said he was struck by a piece of plexiglass while he was working on a boat in the backyard of his home. This directly contradicted the testimony of Michelle, who said that he had explained it as getting hurt during an argument at a college. At this point, the question had become who is lying. Still, the testimony of Dr. Robert Cushing and an emergency room physician at the community hospital of the Monterey Peninsula exonerated him. He said that the laceration on Glaze Brooks' face was not consistent with the scratch from her fingernail and that he treated the wound himself the day after the murder. Witness reports also became complicated, and what was stated on paper was not what was said on the witness stand. To make matters even more complicated, the investigators admitted to having mistakenly destroyed their original outline-style notes after they had typed up the interview reports. Glazebrook further testified that he had played softball on the day of the murder, and yet none of the softball teammates were contacted. On the 8th of December 1983, the murder charges were dropped for what seemed like the last time. The case grew cold as time passed and justice seemed out of reach for the victim. However, in 2021, 40 years after the murder of Sonia Carmen Herrick Stone, detectives in California knocked on Glazebrook's door one more time with an arrest warrant of murder based on evidence gotten from Sonia Herrick case file, which was made possible with modern DNA technology. They finally had him, and there was nowhere for him to go. In honor of Carmen Stone's profession as a merchandiser for Levi Strauss, the detectives wore denim jeans to the scene of the arrest. Glazebrook is now 65 years old and is currently awaiting trial. His bail has been placed at $1 million, and he is currently awaiting trial for what everyone hopes will be the final time. The 3 Florida murders. Florida has had its share of serial killers. There have been the insanely popular, almost culturally viral ones like Ted Bundy, Danny Rolling, and Aline Wuornos, to the less-known killers like Christine Falling and Gary Ray Bowles. However, while these murders got solved and the murderers got apprehended by the police, no series of Florida killings have been quite as mentally tasking and physically draining as the 3 Florida murders. The murders in question began in June 2000 when the body of a 35-year-old female named Kimberly Dietz Livesey was discovered in Cooper City, southwest of Fort Lauderdale. However, not too long after that incident, another body was found. This time it was also a woman named Sia Demas, who was 21 at the time, was found near Dania Beach in the same county that Kimberly's body was found. Then a year later, yet another victim was found, the body of a 24-year-old, Jessica Good, found floating in Biscayne Bay, Miami. The cases of these 3 females proved to be quite difficult. All 3 victims had something in common that made them easy targets for the serial killer. They were all prostitutes who had struggled with substance abuse and were vulnerable as a result. The first solid clue to solving the murders took place after the police had interviewed the last victim, Jessica Good's boyfriend. They were able to identify Roberto Wagner Fernandez as a suspect. He was also a Brazilian citizen living in Miami. And when word started going around that he might be a suspect on a case, he immediately fled to Brazil, which only made things worse. When he fled, detectives found it almost impossible to follow up the case with him because of several bureaucratic challenges. They refused to extradite him because he was a citizen of Brazil, not the United States of America. However, Fernandez failed to keep a low profile in his home country and continued with his crimes. A lot of his crimes were related to violence against sex workers in Brazil, and so the country became more cooperative with investigators. But still, the case progressed at an extremely slow pace. When in 2011, investigators reached a break in the case of his 3rd victim in the U.S., Jessica Good. Detectives immediately flew to Brazil to retrieve DNA evidence from Mr. Fernandez, only to find out that he had died in a plane crash on his way to Paraguay from Brazil in 2005. However, the detectives felt there was a conspiracy somewhere. In a conference, a detective named Scott said that there were a lot of circumstantial evidence that led them to believe that he might have faked his own death. This circumstantial evidence had the enemies he had acquired at the top of the list throughout his life. Fernandez had amassed so many enemies in Brazil that every one of them wanted him dead from getting acquitted after murdering his wife to his wife's family, wanting to kill him in return. It appeared like Fernandez was never far from trouble. So the detectives went on investigating, working with the Justice Department, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and the Brazilian National Police. After several years of back and forth between government bodies in 2 countries, a Brazilian judge was finally persuaded to authorize the exhumation of Mr. Fernandez's body. His grave was open and his DNA profile proved to be very consistent with that found on all 3 victims found in the Florida killings. The Broward County Sheriff, Gregory Toney, said that detectives, some retired, some now deceased, never stopped trying to solve the murders so the families of the victims would know what had happened to their loved ones. One thing that troubled investigators the most was the fact that Mr. Fernandez was never brought to justice for his crimes. However, Detective Scott would later say at a news conference that they wish they could bring him to justice, but unfortunately they couldn't. Still, the fact that his last moments on Earth were filled with terror makes investigators feel a little better. Althea Oakley and Caitlin Arquette. On the 22nd of June, 1988, a 21-year-old Althea Oakley went to a fraternity party with her boyfriend. A few hours into the night, the couple got into a fight that caused Oakley to decide to walk home by herself. On her way home, and while taking a familiar route that was close to the University of New Mexico, she was unfortunately attacked. A year would go by and yet another case popped up. Not long after graduating from Highland High School, an 18-year-old Caitlin Arquette, the daughter of the famous horror thriller writer Lois Duncan, would get shot while she was driving home from a friend's house. The impact of these seemingly unrelated murders was devastating and resonant to the respective families. Lois Duncan immediately halted her career in the thriller and horror genre, started writing books for children while endlessly seeking answers. The Oakley family also sought answers for years. For more than 30 years, questions were asked to which no answer was given. However, on the 20th of July 2021, almost 32 years after Arquette, a 53-year-old man called Paul Apodaca called the University of New Mexico police and told them had information on murders from a long time ago. When he was engaged in a conversation, Apodaca proceeded to confess to the killing of both Arquette and Althea Oakley. Testimonies from Apodaca aligned with the accounts of both victims and the circumstances that led to their deaths. Apodaca would tell the police that he was employed as a security aide at what was once known as TVI but is now known as Central New Mexico Community College. This is when he saw Oakley in the parking lot. After seeing her there, he gave a detailed account of how he got into his car and decided to follow her as she walked along Buena Vista Boulevard all the way to the Lobo parking lot. To make things a little more bizarre, he said that when she was walking past him, she actually said hi to him and smiled. "That's the worst part," he said to the police. "That's the worst part. I heard someone that smiled at me when he was asked what his motive was." Apodaca said, "I think what made me do it, what made me attack her was all the hatred I had for women because growing up, I seen men treating women bad and they go for the bad guys. And I try to be nice and be good. And they just didn't want that. So I was jealous and had hatred. And I just released it." The Albuquerque police chief, Harold Medina, who also happens to be the first recipient of a scholarship set up in Oakley's name in 1990, personally made the drive to Toes to give Oakley's parents the news. In a news conference Tuesday, Harold said that when he arrived there, Oakley's mother thought he was there to tell them they had closed the case. It was a bittersweet ending that gave closure to the parents of the deceased that had waited for so many years for. Apodaca's confession for Arquette's murder also matched and filled in gaps. He said that when she pulled up to an intersection, he shot at her. The car then proceeded to drift across 3 oncoming lanes of traffic before crashing into a light pole near Arnold Street, northeast. Investigators came upon a gray Volkswagen Beetle whose owner was Apodaca and who was suspiciously parked near the scene of the crime, but no efforts were made to bring him into questioning. When asked what his motive was for killing her once again, he answered similarly, "She was just at the wrong place at the wrong time." Ironically, Paul Apodaca's job at TVI at the time was the supervision of parking lots and ensuring that girls got to their car safely and that no one was breaking into cars. He had worked there from 1988 to 1990 and already had a violent criminal history dating back to when he was a juvenile. As recent as 2021, he had pleaded guilty to aggravated assault with a deadly weapon and was sentenced to supervised probation for 3 years. Apodaca is also homeless and has also confessed to killing a third woman in 1988. Police say they believe they know the identity of the other woman he confessed to killing and are talking to her family, but add they're not ready to release her name at this moment. The police say they have charged Apodaca with murder in the first degree in the death of Oakley, and that is the only case he has been charged in because that is the case they have the most evidence in right now. However, with more time, evidence, and his confessions, more charges will be leveled against him. Given everything that happened, an officer asked Apodaca why he chose to confess and Apodaca opened up to him. Apodaca looked at the officer and said that it was a shame that it took him so long to get to this point. He also told him that he now realized that what he did was evil and dark, and that it was the word of God that helped him overcome his struggle. Michelle Wyatt. Michelle Wyatt was born and bred in San Diego, where she went to Patrick Henry High School and graduated in 1977. By October of 1980, she was attending Grossmont College and working as a side hustle as a cashier at a Mission Hills Safeway store. People knew her as a driven woman who was very independent. Her father, Raymond Wyatt, testified to that. She also had good grades, and from a very young age, she was clear about what she wanted from life. She also loved the great outdoors and engaged in activities like scuba diving and skating. Friends spoke about how sweet she was and how hard it was for her to say or do anything that would hurt anyone's feelings. On the 9th of October 1980, and in the hours before the terrible attack, Michelle Wyatt had spent time with her boyfriend hanging out, playing pool and just having fun. Then shortly after midnight, around 1 a.m., her boyfriend left, locking the door behind him. And sometimes after that, residents in neighboring condos heard a scream coming from a condo. No one called 911. The person screaming was Michelle Wyatt. There was no sign of forced entry, and it looked like the individual that committed the act had just walked straight in. The crime scene was taped. Statements were taken in, and clues were sought endlessly. But still, the case confounded every investigator that picked up the file. DNA, which seemed to be the white knight in every tale of homicide, wasn't helpful. After a lot of work with little to no effort to show for it, the case was closed for years until a retired San Diego sex crime and homicide detective decided to pick up the case. He began to deduce what might have happened that night that would have caused the killer to get into a door without having to force it open. He theorized that Wyatt was unlikely to open the door for a stranger at that time. He said that the killer must have been watching her and almost definitely knocked on her door mere moments after her boyfriend left to give the impression that it was her boyfriend at the door who had maybe forgotten something. In June 2000, more DNA testing revealed there were 2 DNA profiles on the crime scene. One was her boyfriend, who was later eliminated as a suspect, and the other was an unidentified person whose DNA produced no match on the National DNA Criminal Database. 2 decades would pass, and they tried yet again to see if a match would be produced. Yet again, they found nothing. It was when they decided to use genetic genealogy that they began to see progress, and homicide investigators finally identified a suspect. A man named John Patrick Hogan was just 18 years old when Wyatt was killed. However, no arrest could be made because Hogan had died 17 years ago at the age of 42 from a drug overdose on October 9, 2004. This discovery was made through the use of genetic genealogy, and this was exactly 24 years from the day Wyatt was killed by him. Hogan's death meant that the detectives tracked down his relatives, who then provided DNA samples to help to confirm his identity. After he was positively identified as the killer, it was found that Hogan was born in Arizona and had once lived in the same condo where he would later kill Wyatt. He had moved there in the 1970s and still had friends in the complex when he committed the terrible crime. Shortly before the killing, he had joined the Air Force. He had also spent a brief time in New Mexico, where he was stationed. Subsequently, and during the time of the crime, he was shuttling between his birthplace, Arizona, and California. Detective Lieutenant Tom Seaver, who had been supervising the case, made it clear what would have happened if he were still alive. He's the one that committed the sexual assault and murder. He would be arrested if he was alive. Michelle's parents, who are both aged 80, had spent most of their lives pursuing this case and trying to find their daughter's killer to no avail. When the news got to them, they were not sure how to feel or react. They missed their daughter, but they also wished they could confront the man who killed her. Michelle's mother, Louise, had this to say: "Okay, he's dead, but I would have liked to have been able to talk to this man personally. I just feel horrible for the ending." Ultimately, Michelle Wyatt's parents were grateful to the detectives for pursuing for over 40 years on a case that many others would have abandoned and forgotten. The man who committed the crime might have met his end, but at the very least, the questions the victim's family had always wanted for some semblance of closure had finally been answered. Plus, the spirit of Michelle Wyatt can now peacefully rest. A young couple from Great Falls went on a date on the night of the 2nd of January 1956. But as the sky grew darker and the air got stiffer, neither of them returned home. They were 16-year-old Patricia Kalitsky and 18-year-old Lloyd Dwayne Bogle. Patricia was a junior in high school at the time, and although she had only met Dwayne a month prior at her cousin's wedding, the two appeared to be smitten with one another and would spend quite a bit of time together. Dwayne and Patricia were last seen alive at around 9 p.m., leaving Pete's Drive-In restaurant in the Great Falls area. They then headed west out of Central Avenue to a well-known Lover's Lane, located close to Wadsworth Park. Neither Patricia nor Dwayne was heard from again. Patricia's older sister had eloped when she was around the same age as Patricia was at the time, so her parents had initially assumed she had eloped with Dwayne. Dwayne was an airman stationed at Malmstrom Air Force Base, where he had recently risen to the rank of Sergeant Second Class. Here, he was assigned to the 29th Fighter Interceptor Squadron. Upon taking a closer look at Patricia's life and tendencies, they soon grew worried because although the couple had discussed the idea of getting married, Patricia was hardly the type to elope. She was a diligent student and had high school classes to attend the next day. She also had dreams of going to college once she finished high school. In addition to this, the couple was known to adhere to Patricia's curfew and were not expected to stay out late. Dwayne was also well accepted by Patricia's family, who considered him to be part of the family. So all in all, the couple had no reasons to disappear voluntarily. That same night, 2 women and 2 airmen drove past a man lying on the ground between a car and a tree. But they did not think much of the sighting and just assumed that the man was too inebriated to drive and had simply passed out on the ground beside his car. Had they stopped and checked on the man, they would have discovered that the man was in fact deceased. The next morning, on the 3rd of January 1956, 3 young boys were taking a walk in the Great Falls area, discovering the remains of 18-year-old Lloyd Dwayne Bogle. His remains were positioned such that half his body was under his car with the other half visible outside. Dwayne had his wrists tied behind his back with his own belt, and he had been shot through the skull. The car's ignition switch was still turned on and the headlights were turned on. A coronial inquest recommended an autopsy be done on Dwayne's remains. And while investigators knew he was shot, they were unable to recover the bullet. Investigators were still trying to recover the bullet in hopes that it would give them contextual clues about the perpetrator. During the autopsy, it was discovered that Dwayne had likely been alive for hours after he was shot. A day later, on the 5th of January 1956, the remains of Patricia Kalitsky were recovered from a rocky ravine about 8 miles from where Dwayne's remains were found. She was found fully clothed and her remains were at the edge of a 20-foot embankment, just off of a highway around 6 miles northwest of central Montana. Both robbery and sexual assault were initially ruled out as motives, since an expensive camera was found in Dwayne's car, in addition to a $5 bill that was found in his wallet. There were no signs indicating that Patricia had been sexually assaulted when her remains were first examined. However, during her autopsy, it was discovered that she had likely been sexually assaulted. News articles that reported on the crime only mentioned this in passing, possibly since discussing the topic was not socially acceptable at the time. Although technology did not exist to analyze DNA evidence at the time, coroners still collected a vaginal swab, which they stored carefully for decades to come. They also found several wounds caused by blunt force trauma, indicating that a struggle had likely ensued between Patricia and the killer. That same day, investigators questioned a possible suspect in relation to the killings, which they had described as Chinese-style executions. There is no doubt that this term would not be used today, but at the time it was far from being socially unacceptable. The personal details of this potential suspect were never released, but it was stated that he was an airman who worked with Dwayne. Just a few days prior to the killings, Patricia's mother had a conversation with Dwayne because he seemed visibly upset. She had asked him what was bothering him, to which he responded, "I've got the blues and just can't shake them," before going on to say that he had had an argument with a friend. This suspect was eventually ruled out. In November of 1989, investigators decided to look for the bullet in a tree nearby. In an interview with the Associated Press, Cascade County Sheriff Barry McElhody stated, "The tree has always been of major interest to law enforcement officers because that's where he was killed, right at the tree. The recovery of the bullet used to kill Dwayne would allow investigators to identify the caliber of the weapon used to shoot him and determine if the bullet is potentially linked to any firearm confiscated in other incidents over the years. Sergeant Dick Duncan stated in the same interview that previous attempts to X-ray the tree were unsuccessful due to the size and density of its bark. The tree was around 80 feet tall, and its trunk was around 4.5 feet in diameter. Investigators planned to shave around 33 growth rings off its bottom half, according to Sheriff Michelotti. He stated, "Once we hit the 33-year mark on the tree, we should see an entry if the bullet went into the tree, a hole, a tunnel." Hopes of finding the perpetrator were renewed when investigators recovered bullets from the cottonwood tree. However, this hope was short-lived as the bullets could not be matched to a firearm involved in another crime. While there weren't any substantial breakthroughs in this case, it was never stagnant and investigators continued to pursue any and all leads they received. As many as 35 people were questioned in connection with the case. One of the potential suspects in this case was Edward Wayne Edwards, who had been arrested in Montana in 1956 for burglary. In 1955, he escaped from Akron prison and went on a spree robbing gas stations across the country. In 1961, he was put on the FBI's most wanted list, after which he was caught in 1962. He was subsequently paroled in 1967. It wasn't until 2009 that he was arrested again, and in 2010, he pleaded guilty to killing 4 people. 29-year-old Billy Lovaco, 18-year-old Judith Straub, 19-year-old Tim Hack, and 19-year-old Kelly Drew. Edwards subsequently confessed to killing 25-year-old Danny Lochner in 2011. He also confessed to convincing Danny Boy, who was a soldier in the U.S. Army, to go AWOL. Edwards later shot Danny Boy and buried him in a shallow grave. He was sentenced to death in March of 2011 for his involvement in the death of Danny Boy, but he died in prison just 1 month later due to natural causes. The metaphorical point of connection between Edwards and the Kalitsky-Bogel killings was his MO. Edwards was known to target couples in lovers' lanes, similar to where Patricia and Dwayne were when they were killed. His crimes were referred to as the sweetheart murders. Another suspect in the killings was James Joseph Whitey Bulger, who was a notorious criminal in the area. Bulger had been arrested for sexual assault in 1951. He was known to have been in the area when the killings occurred, but there was no evidence that could prove his involvement. As the years went by with no new leads, the trail for the man who killed Patricia and Dwayne went cold. In 2012, Sergeant John Cadner, the head of detectives for the CCSO, was assigned to this case. In a presentation, Sergeant Cadner stated that DNA evidence from the vaginal swab had been sent to the State Crime Lab in 2001 by Detective Phil Madison, who was investigating the case at the time. It was proven that the DNA was not Dwayne's and was subsequently entered into Cody's. There had been no matches since then. After being assigned to the case, Sergeant Cadner worked with Bode Technology to recreate the DNA sample. In 2019, they had successfully recreated the sample recovered. This time, in addition to comparing it with the samples entered in Cody's, they also decided to compare it to DNA submitted by members of the public to open-source DNA databases. Open-source DNA databases are used by people who want to conduct independent research into their family trees. Just a year prior, in 2018, the Golden State Killer had been apprehended because members of his family had submitted their DNA to a similar open-source DNA database, subsequently leading to his identification and arrest. The sample uploaded by Sergeant Cadner was compatible with those uploaded by 3 other people, and investigators got into contact with them and their family members. DNA samples were collected, and it was determined that the most likely match for the DNA sample recovered from Patricia Kalitsky's remains was Kenneth Gould. Sergeant Cadner stated in an interview with NPR, "Was great because for the first time in 65 years, we finally had a direction and a place to investigate because that was all theories until then. We finally got a game and we got a name. It changed the whole dynamic of the case." They did, however, have another problem. Kenneth Gould had passed away in 2007 and his remains had been cremated. Authorities then reached out to his children and explained the case to them, following which they agreed to submit their DNA for comparison. Investigators were initially skeptical about approaching them, but they were fully cooperative. Sergeant Cadner stated in an interview with the Waco Tribune-Herald, "I wasn't sure how they were going to react when I come to them saying, 'Hey, your dad's a suspect in this case,' but they were great to work with. When their DNA was compared with the DNA found at the scene, it matched." Kenneth Gould was a Great Falls native who was known to ride his horses around the Vineyard Road area where Patricia's remains had been found. He lived close to Patricia's parents at one point, but beyond this, he had no connection to either Patricia or Dwayne. When Kenneth Gould was 25, he married a 16-year-old, which is the same age Patricia was at the time of the killing. A month after the killings, Kenneth Gould uprooted his whole life and moved his family to Tracy before moving to Geraldine, then to Hamilton, before finally moving out of the state of Montana to Missouri, never to return. It was finally announced that Kenneth Gould was the most likely suspect in the killings since he was deceased at the time and his guilt could therefore not be irrefutably proven without a fair trial. Sergeant Cadner stated, "Obviously I can't put the gun in his hand, but when you put everything together, there's no doubt in my mind that he's the suspect." Kenneth Gould's daughter reportedly told Sergeant Cadner, "You never know. Some people just have secrets they never told anybody." The families of Dwayne Bogle and Patricia Kalitsky were finally contacted and offered the closure they had spent over 65 years waiting for. While they were happy to finally have answers, the revelation also opened old wounds for the families, especially for the people who were old enough to have known the couple personally. Sergeant Cadner stated, "They are excited, but at the same time it brought back a lot of memories. You had two young, vibrant individuals that were well-liked among their peer group. Investigators poured their hearts and soul into this case. They leave a little bit of themselves from what I've seen." Patricia Kalitsky's sister, who was the only surviving member of the family, had advanced dementia by the time her sister's killer was identified. The Bogle family had been torn apart for years with stories about what might have happened to Dwayne, including unsubstantiated rumors that he had been involved with the mob. Dwayne was survived by his niece, Karen Bogle McCarthy, who was 54 at the time. Her father, James Bogle, was Dwayne's younger brother and had idolized him growing up. In an interview with the New York Times, Karen stated, "It's like it just happened yesterday. So if I was asked, is this great modern technology a great thing? I would say on balance, yes, for my generation, a generation once removed, but it definitely reopens old wounds that have had a chance to crust over." In an interview with KRTV, Edgar Wilson, who was Kenneth Gould's neighbor for 10 years in Missouri, stated, "I can't believe this stuff about Ken. I just plain do not believe it. He was easygoing and soft-spoken. He didn't drink. He didn't raise Cain. I never heard him cuss in my life. Just a real good man." During his time in Missouri, Kenneth Gould lived on a farm with his family where he raised sheep and goats and was a horse trainer with a stellar reputation. It is impossible to know the motive behind this crime because the only 3 people who could potentially shed light on it are all deceased. All we know for sure at this point in time is that, like Kenneth Gould's daughter stated, some people just have secrets they never tell. The 1984 case of Virginia Hannon. 59-year-old Virginia Hannon lived in a relatively quiet neighborhood in Pembroke, Massachusetts. She'd spent most of her life working as the lunch lady at a local elementary school called Bryantville Elementary School, and almost everyone in the neighborhood had witnessed her kindness and caring nature firsthand. She loved working with kids and was known to be really good at cooking. She lived a quiet, humble life and was quite hospitable to her neighbors. So everyone who knew her was shocked and horrified when on the 13th of February, 1984, someone broke into Virginia's home and killed her. Virginia had lived alone because her husband had passed away 13 years before her death. The quaint yellow house she lived in quickly became a symbol of kindness in the area, and Virginia would often offer juice, cookies, and baked goods to the neighborhood kids who would often stop by the house. She was also known to feed and care for the stray animals that would wander into the area. She had actually retired from her job early because her aunt, who lived in California, had left Virginia around $380,000 when she passed away. She was fairly open about the inheritance to everyone who asked because she had no inhibitions when it came to sharing details about her life with other people, even if they were strangers. While it was known that she had stored a majority of the amount in the bank, it was widely speculated that she kept a part of the inheritance in cash hidden around her house. This has never been confirmed as the actual cause for the break-in and attack on Virginia, But it is possible that the news of the money she had hidden around the house could have been heard by the wrong type of person. The last known sighting of Virginia was on the evening of the 11th of February 1984, which was a Saturday. Virginia and a friend of hers named Dolly Harmouth had gone to church together. The church they attended was called St. Joseph's Church, and it was around 4 miles away from Virginia's house. The evening mass commenced at around 5 p.m., like usual, and the women had stayed for the entirety of the mass before driving to their usual dinner spot, which was BR's restaurant. This restaurant was around 7 miles away from the church, and they would eat dinner there every week after mass. Dolly was the last person to see Virginia alive, other than the perpetrator, and she dropped Virginia off at her house at around 7:30 p.m. Dolly did say that Virginia struggled to breathe while climbing the steps to her house, but this was normal for Virginia. She has a health condition called emphysema, which made it difficult for her to breathe if she did anything too physically taxing. Nobody in the neighborhood heard from her or saw her on Sunday, so it is believed that the attack likely happened shortly after she returned home from church. Virginia was the primary caregiver for her stepfather, who also lived in the neighborhood, and she would normally prepare his lunch every day and take it over to his house. However, on Monday the 13th of February, lunchtime had come and passed, but there was no sign of Virginia. Her stepfather's help had actually been trying to contact her to see if she had a spare key to his house, but had been unable to reach her, so she decided to stop by Virginia's house to see if everything was okay and ask for the key in person. It was then that the house help discovered that Virginia had been killed in her bed. Signs of serious physical injury could be seen even though her blanket had been used to cover her up. Investigators were immediately called to the scene, and they found a pair of nylon stockings, which they believe was used to kill Virginia. In addition to this, there was a shoe print on her stomach area, which led investigators to believe that the perpetrator kicked her at some point during the attack. This death came as a shock to the entire neighborhood because Virginia was so well liked by everyone in the community, and it was difficult for people to think of someone who would want to harm her. The front door and a window next to it had been tampered with, which indicated that the attacker broke into the house and Virginia did not let them in out of her own free will. In addition to this, Dahl had told investigators that when they went to dinner, Virginia had a $100 bill in her wallet. But when her wallet was checked by police, the $100 bill was gone. This indicated that robbery could have been a possible motive for the attack. And this is actually why a lot of people believe the attack was carried out, because the perpetrator thought she had a part of the inheritance money in the house. The search for the attacker led nowhere, because investigators were unable to identify any suspects. Her neighbors had also not heard anything unusual on the night of her death that might have indicated a struggle. Without any clues or leads, it became difficult for police to identify a suspect. In 2018, the evidence found at the scene of the crime was retested and a male DNA profile was generated from it. But unfortunately, there was nothing to compare this DNA with. So the trail for Virginia's killer went cold. Around 37 years passed before the police caught their big break. On the 3rd of February 2020, a 58-year-old man named Jesse Alley Ward passed away. A year prior to his death, Jesse had told a friend of his that he was responsible for the death of Virginia Hannon. After Jesse passed away, this friend informed police of this occurrence, and they used a blood sample from Jesse's remains to compare his DNA to the DNA found at the scene. It was a match. Jesse had been 22 years old at the time of Virginia's death. In March of 2021, the Plymouth County District Attorney's Office announced the news to the public while also stating that there was no known connection between Jesse and Virginia prior to the attack and that she likely did not know him. Virginia's nephew, Richard Hannon, and his wife, Judy Hannon, have since come forward to express their gratitude to the police officers who kept working on Virginia's case throughout the years. This really is one of the cases that really reinforces how the development of forensic technology can spearhead the effort to solve cold cases and bring closure to victims' families. Cold case of Janet Broskew. 20-year-old Janet Broskew had gone out with some of her friends on the 23rd of December, 1987. She left the bar 45 minutes before her friends did, with a man they had met and gotten acquainted with mere hours before her disappearance. Little did her friends know that when Janet left the bar that night, they were seeing her alive for the last time. The group of friends initially went bowling and had plans to go get drinks together afterwards. They went to the Waterville bowling alley, and it is here that the group met and got acquainted with two men who were also bowling there. In fact, they got along so well that they planned to regroup later on during the night at a bar and lounge spot called T. Woody's, which was located on the Waterville concourse. The two groups then went their separate ways. When Janet and her friends reached T. Woody's, everyone was allowed inside, except for Janet. This was because the legal drinking age in Maine had been increased to 21 in July of 1985, and Janet was only 20 years old. By this time, it was almost midnight, and the men they had met earlier had also arrived at the bar. One of these men told Janet he would drop her back at her house, and she accepted this offer. She was last seen by her friends leaving the bar with this man. Shortly after they left, though, the man returned to the bar alone to get Janet's purse. She had accidentally forgotten her purse at the bar, and he had come back inside to get it while she was waiting in the car. After Janet had left, her friends stayed at the bar for around another 45 minutes before leaving. Janet did not return home that night, and her parents, Albert Brosque and Geraldine Brosque, contacted investigators on the morning of the 24th of December to report their daughter as missing. It was also possible for Janet to need medical assistance because she was diabetic and took insulin on a regular basis to regulate her blood sugar levels. The search for Janet began almost immediately after the missing persons report was filed. Police spoke to the man who had offered to take Janet home the night before, but he claimed that when he went back to the parking lot after fetching Janet's purse, she appeared to be sick. Because of this, he told her he could no longer take her home, and according to him, this was the last time he saw her. And he claimed to have no involvement in her disappearance. The search for Janet continued for 3 months until the 18th of March, 1988, when a man found her remains floating near the Waverly Dam in the Sabus-Cook River. Her remains were found in an unclothed state. An autopsy was performed on her remains, but the medical examiner could not determine the cause of Janet's death. While it was believed that her body had been submerged in the water from the night she had disappeared, no further statements could be made about how she had died. In addition to this, investigators also thought it was a possibility that she either jumped off the bridge or was pushed off the bridge, which begs the question, if she had jumped, what happened to her clothes? Granted, it had been 3 months since she likely died, and her clothes would have gone through severe decomposition due to exposure to the elements, but they would have been there just the same. In addition to this, only a couple of months after Janet's remains were discovered, a 23-year-old woman from Waterville was also killed in a manner that bore uncanny similarities to how Janet was killed. This woman was Geraldine and Finn, who was last seen on the 9th of August, 1988 at a bar. She had gone out to Pete and Larry's, which was a bar on Upper Main Street. While she was in the company of her co-workers, a man walked over to speak with her. This man was described as being around 5 foot, 10 inches tall, and possibly weighing around 150 pounds. He had dark hair, and one distinct feature that her friends remembered was the tattoo of a diamond he had on his shoulder. Geraldine's remains were found near Skohagen by a man who was taking a walk around his land. The land was near a wooded area. Geraldine had also been found unclothed. However, this time investigators had enough evidence to apprehend the killer, who was 29-year-old Gerald Goodall. Gerald was found guilty of killing Geraldine Finn and received a sentence of 75 years. Following his arrest and conviction, he was also questioned extensively in relation to Janet Brosh's death, but he denied any involvement in her death. Due to a lack of evidence, investigators could not charge him with killing Janet, but they strongly believed that he was the perpetrator due to the numerous similarities between the cases. Unfortunately, the lack of evidence did result in Janet's case going cold for more than 3 decades. It wasn't until May of 2021 that they were finally able to arrest Gerald for killing Janet Brosque. Since the case is still through the legal system, the nature of the new evidence found is still unspecified. While an article published in the Bangor Daily News on the 22nd of August, 1988, states that Gerald had seen Janet briefly at the bar's parking lot. On the night of her death, no statements have been made that verify whether he was the man who was supposed to drive her home. An official arraignment hearing is yet to occur in this case, which has been attributed to the difficult circumstances that the world is presently in. Unfortunately, Geraldine Brochu died in 2015, and Albert Brochu passed away in January of 2021, mere months before Janet's killer would be brought to justice. So neither of her parents were able to see their daughter's case resolved. As for the new evidence, we will have to wait and see what the arraignment hearing brings to light. The cold case of Leola Jordan. Even in 2021, the Picayune Police Department was working tirelessly to solve a 2-decade-old cold case. A family needed answers. These answers came in the form of DNA test results just 1 month prior to the 23rd anniversary of Leola Jordan's death. Everyone in the neighborhood loved Leola, and the horrific manner that she was killed left them all begging for answers. Leola lived in a relatively quiet neighborhood in the Pearl River County of Picayune, Mississippi. People from her neighborhood described Leola as being friendly and well-liked. She had lived there all her life and had 7 children, all of whom grew up in the neighborhood. On the 30th of June, 1998, Leola Jordan had been attacked with a knife in her home on Washington Street and died as a result of her injuries. Investigators believe that the perpetrator was led into the house by Leola herself, because there was no sign of the locks on her doors or windows to suggest that they had been tampered with. Several members of Leola's family also told investigators that she always locked her front door, so it was unlikely that the killer walked in on his own. From the crime scene, investigators initially determined that there may have been a fight or disagreement of some kind when Leola woke up, which escalated and resulted in the killer attacking her before fleeing the scene of the crime. For almost 23 years, this case remained unsolved. That was until Captain Rhonda Jones of the Picayune Police Department began to review Leola's case in October of 2020. She worked in collaboration with a popular show called Cold Justice, which is produced by the Oxygen Network. Due to a lack of resources, the police department took the help of the show to get DNA evidence found at the scene of the crime to be tested. The show helped them send it to a private facility which had a much quicker turnaround time. When the crime scene was first processed back in 1998, investigators collected almost a dozen samples of the nightgown Leola was wearing when she was killed, in the hopes that they could potentially find the killer's DNA on it. But since the Picayune Police Department did not have the resources to process this DNA evidence, it remained untested till 2021. The result of the DNA testing was what allowed investigators to finally arrest the man responsible for killing Leola Jordan, her now 47-year-old grandson, Sergio A. Williams. Her family was finally able to receive some sort of closure with regard to the death of the person they described as the matriarch of the family. In fact, Leola was scheduled to visit her granddaughter for her nursing school pinning ceremony, which was taking place in Juliet just the day after she was killed. Several of the investigating officers who responded to the scene, including Picayune Police Chief Freddie Drennan and Assistant Chief of Police Jeremy Magri, have stated that the horrific nature of the crime made it extremely important for them to solve the case. They've also stated that they are grateful to be able to provide closure to Leola's family after all these years. The Pecos Jane Doe, identified in March 2021. On the 5th of July 1966, a man and a woman checked into the Roper's Motel, which was located right on Highway 80. Just a few hours after they checked in, a maid working at the hotel would find the woman drowned in the hotel pool, and the man would drive away, never to be seen or heard from again. In addition to this, investigators had no idea who the deceased woman was, and it would take several decades for her to be identified. Its location made it a prime spot for transients and people looking to rest for a while before continuing their journey. The couple checked in under the names Mrs. and Mr. Russell Batwan. People who saw the couple at the hotel later stated that the man looked a lot older than his wife did, at least by a decade. The woman was described as looking Mediterranean and having a tanned complexion with dark hair. Later that day, a maid working at the hotel found the body of Mrs. Batwan floating in the motel's swimming pool. The maid, who did not know what to do, went and sought the help of a waitress at the motel's cafe. The waitress, with the help of another guest, brought Mrs. Batwan's remains onto the deck of the pool. First responders arrived at the scene and tried to revive the woman, but she was already unresponsive by then. She was then taken to Reeves County Memorial Hospital and was declared dead on arrival. Meanwhile, the man who was with her, supposedly her husband, went to the front desk of the motel and asked for his identification card. When the motel employee asked him why he needed it, he said he needed to provide it to the police as a form of identification so they could begin processing his wife's drowning. The employee then gave the identification card back to the man. He was then seen getting into his car and driving away, never to be seen again. He was reportedly asleep in his room when his wife had drowned in the pool. But the way he removed himself from the situation altogether makes him seem extremely suspicious, to say the least. If she was really his wife, you would think he would have at least gone to the hospital she was taken to. But he did not go to the hospital or ever attempt to claim responsibility for her remains. When an autopsy was performed, the medical examiner found a small red scrape just above the victim's left cheekbone. Other than this mark, there was no other evidence to suggest that the drowning was premeditated. As a result, the woman's cause of death was declared as an accidental drowning. Following the autopsy, the woman's remains were sent to the Pecos funeral home in the hopes that someone would come forward to claim responsibility. The drowning did receive quite a bit of media attention, and as a result, people from several different states reached out to investigate the possibility that the deceased woman could have possibly been a relative. Several members of the community were deeply touched by the tragedy and donated money to cover the cost of buying her headstone. In fact, this headstone is one of the saddest parts of this case. Simply reads, "Unknown girl drowned." Nobody ever deserves to be laid to rest in that way, and it just makes it sadder to know that this woman's family was likely looking for her during this time. Unbeknownst to investigators and her family, the Pecos Jane Doe had left behind the most viable clue about her own identity. You see, when her autopsy was performed, 2 words were documented as being scribbled on her right foot. These words were Joe and Lena. The unidentified woman's details actually had to be entered into NamUs manually towards the end of 2014. And it was while they prepared to enter her details that investigators realized that her age had been listed as approximately 19 on her death certificate. This approximation meant that there was a good chance that the Pecos Jane Doe was actually a minor at the time of her death. However, due to the lack of personal details, she remained unidentified for decades to come. In August of 2019, the Pecos Police Department exhumed her remains and decided to have them genetically tested in the hopes that they would be able to connect her with living members of her family. Her DNA profile was then uploaded onto a database to see if they were able to get a match. But since several decades had passed since her death, this proved unfruitful as well. The case grew cold once more, and it wasn't until investigators realized that they could use genetic genealogy that they finally caught a break in the case. In March of 2021, they got a familial match. A DNA ancestry site called Family Tree DNA had shown that the closest match to the Pecos Jane Doe were 3 siblings from Texas. By examining their family tree, investigators were able to connect the Pecos Jane Doe to the Hemi family, who were from Salina, Kansas. The Pecos Jane Doe was finally identified as Jolene Hemi. Jolene's sister, Joyce Hemi, was the first to be notified, and she described Jolene as a shy girl. Jolene and Joyce were only 14 months apart, and they were extremely close growing up. At the time of her disappearance, Jolene had a much older boyfriend, who the family did not particularly like. This was because he was known to treat Jolene poorly. Joyce last saw Jolene on the 1st of July, 1966. Since then, the family has been searching tirelessly for her. On the 3rd of July, Joyce received a letter which stated, "Joyce, well, I got lost. See you in a couple of weeks, maybe, Joe." The family does not believe this letter was written by Jolene, because nobody in the family called her Joe. Members of Jolene's family strongly believe that the man who was with her is responsible for her death, because she did not know how to swim, and it was unlikely that she would have gotten into the pool on her own. Since then, her death certificate has been updated to show her actual name, and investigators have stated that they are still interested in speaking with the man who checked into the motel with her back in 1966. We've heard of killers confessing to their crimes while being investigated. We've heard of confessions happening by chance. And we've even heard of deathbed confessions. But what about confessions that occur sporadically with no rhyme or reason? Seems odd, doesn't it? Well, that's exactly what happened with the convicted serial killer Edward Surratt. The front page of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette from July of 1978 reads, "Coon links Surratt to 18 slayings in the area." Despite this, investigators were unable to ever link him to the crimes beyond a reasonable doubt. The modus operandi was a match, but there was no solid physical evidence to place him at the scene of the crimes. That was until he confessed to them himself. During Surratt's stint as a trucker with routes through Pennsylvania and Ohio, it was discovered that he could potentially be linked to 27 unsolved killings between the two states. The first one of these killings to which Edward had a known connection to was the killing of Luther Langford. On the 1st of June, 1978, Luther had been found deceased at his residence in the Western Columbia neighborhood of South Carolina. Luther had died as a result of the attack, but his wife made it out alive. Edward was seen publicly driving around in Luther's car, and investigators had tried to apprehend Edward for this crime, but he managed to get away. The car, however, was still recovered, and investigators found a baseball bat with Edward's fingerprints on it inside the car. This bat was likely used to kill Luther. While searching Luther's car for evidence, investigators also recovered several things that were the property of Joseph Weinman. Joseph was a veteran, and he and his wife were found deceased in their home on the 30th of September. Just like Luther, they were also beaten badly. In addition to this, he was also a person of interest in the killings of Frank Ziegler, Richard Hyde, Donna Hyde, William Adams, and Nancy Adams. Frank had been shot while in his house, which was a stone's throw from the Weinman residence. Donna and Richard Hyde were killed using a shotgun, and their remains were found at their house in Moon Township on the 4th of December, 1977. William Adams was 29 years old at the time of his death, and while his remains were recovered, his wife was nowhere to be found. Edward had also been placed in Breezewood, Pennsylvania on the 31st of December, 1977, when Guy Mills, Laura Mills, and Joel Kruger were killed using a shotgun. Despite this, Edward managed to evade authorities. That is until July of 1978. On the 1st of July, 1978, Edward broke into a house and burglarized the family of 3 living in it. He then tied the parents up and assaulted their 15-year-old daughter. Following the attack, Edward got drunk and fell asleep in one of the family's bedrooms. The family managed to escape during this time, and police were called to the scene. When police arrived, Edward was reportedly still blacked out, and they were able to arrest him without any physical altercations. The trial for these crimes was held in late 1978, and on the 20th of September 1978, he was found guilty and sentenced to 2 life terms plus 200 years. During the sentencing hearing, Edward confessed to killing John Shelkins in Baden, Pennsylvania, back in January 1978. Since he was already going to be spending the rest of his life behind bars, he was not charged in relation to John's death. But in the summer of 1979, he was put on trial for killing 66-year-old Luther Langford in Western Columbia, South Carolina, in June of 1978. He was found guilty and sentenced to 2 more life terms. Since then, he has been transferred between several prisons due to violent behavior and an attempt to escape from prison. The remainder of cases from 1977 to 1978 subsequently went cold. This was because even though investigators knew Edward was responsible, there was not enough evidence to charge him with the crimes. His confession in 2021 was not the first confession he has made while being incarcerated. In 2007, he confessed to killing 6 people, including David Hamilton and Linda Hamilton on the 20th of September 1978, John Davis and Mary Davis in November of 1977, and John Feeney and his fiancée, Renee Greger, on the 22nd of October 1977. John and Renee were only teenagers at the time of their deaths. While investigators are sure that Edward is guilty of these crimes, the timing of his confession is viewed as suspicious. Immediately after confessing to these crimes, Edward asked to be transferred to a prison in South Carolina in exchange for details on the location of the remains of Renee Greger, Linda Hamilton, and David Hamilton, but his request was denied. Following this, in June of 2021, he confessed to killing William Adams, Nancy Adams, Guy Mills, Laura Mills, and Joel Kruger in 1977, and to killing John Shelkins in 1978. With these crimes coming to light, a clear modus operandi has emerged. Edward typically burglarizes homes, regardless of whether more than one person is living there, and is known to shoot his victims. Several of their burial sites have never been identified, and as a result, several families are still waiting for closure on what happened to their loved ones. His crimes spanned between 1977 and 1978, meaning he killed at least 12 people in just 1 year. He is considered a suspect in the unsolved deaths of at least 10 more people in the states of Ohio, Pennsylvania, and South Carolina. Even though he is personally admitted to killing 12 people, Edward Surratt has only been convicted in relation to the death of one person. Law enforcement's reasoning behind this is that he is already behind bars and that it would take up a lot of money and resources to extradite him and put him on trial for these killings. However, this cannot possibly mean much to the families of his victims, to whom this is nothing but blatant disrespect. Annette Schnee and Bobby Joe Oberholzer. In 1982, in Breckenridge, Colorado, 2 lifeless bodies of 2 different women were discovered. The crime scenes were miles from one another and the bodies were found 6 months apart, and yet police believed that both women were killed on the same night by the same man. The only thing connecting them? Orange socks. On January 6, 1982, Bobby Joe Oberholzer, 29 years old, left home at 7:15 a.m. Her day had begun as usual and she hitchhiked to work. Jeff Oberholzer was Bobby's husband. He ran an appliance repair business and she worked as a receptionist. They had been married for about 4.5 years at the time of Bobby's death, and they lived in Elma, 14 miles away from where her body was eventually found. At 6:20 p.m., Jeff got a call from Bobby saying she was having drinks with friends after work. He asked her if she wanted him to pick her up, but she told him that she would get a ride home. Jeff made dinner and waited for Bobby to come home. At some point, he fell asleep. He woke up around midnight and discovered that his wife hadn't returned. Jeff drove into Breckenridge to look for Bobby, and a friend told him she left the bar around 7:30 p.m. They assumed she'd a ride home. When Jeff reported to police that Bobby was missing, they told him it was too early to file a report. Finally, he drove back home to wait for his wife. The next morning, a farmer who lived 30 miles outside Breckenridge found Bobby's driver's license on his property. When Jeff and 2 friends were on their way to pick it up, they made a disturbing discovery. Something blue in a snow-covered field. It was Bobby's backpack, the one she always had with her. Next to the backpack was one of Bobby's gloves, spattered with blood and several bloody tissues. Jeff's friends held him organized a search. 2 hours later, they found Bobby's lifeless body more than 15 miles from where her backpack was discovered. She'd been shot twice. Her house keys were found at the scene. At the crime scene, police found 3 intriguing clues. The only footprints near the body were from Bobby. A plastic cord was tied around one of her wrists, and a single orange sock was found nearby. The same day Bobby Joe's body was found, another woman, Annette Schnee, 21 years old, was reported missing. Annette was a cocktail waitress in Frisco, Colorado, and like Bobby, often hitchhiked to and from work. Because of the similarities, both cases were immediately connected by the police. Investigators questioned Jeff about Annette. At first, he denied knowing her. However, after seeing her picture on the news, he recalled meeting her once. Jeff claimed he had once picked up Annette when she was hitchhiking and he had given her his business card, but he had never seen or heard from her since that day. He also denied any involvement in her disappearance or Bobby's death. On July 3, 1982, 6 months after her disappearance and 13 miles away from where Bobby Joe's body had been found, Annette's body was discovered. Police were shocked with the discovery that she was wearing the match for the orange sock. Jeff's business card was found inside her wallet. The prime suspect immediately became Jeff Oberholzer. Authorities tried to put together a scenario for what might have happened on the night of January 6th. Annette Schnee was last seen in Breckenridge at around 4 p.m. in deep conversation with an unidentified dark-haired woman. Police believe that around 5 p.m., Annette left to hitchhike home. The suspect picked her up and drove 20 miles south of Breckenridge. He took her down a small dead-end road where he assaulted her in his vehicle. While she was getting dressed, She forgot to put on her other orange sock and attempted to escape when she was shot in the back while running away. Police believe the suspect then drove back to Breckenridge and found his second victim, Bobby Joe Oberholzer. He drove Bobby 10 miles south of Breckenridge to a scenic overlook where he attempted to assault her. Bobby managed to escape from the vehicle where the orange sock then fell out. The suspect then chased her down the road and shot her twice as she turned away. Police felt the fact that Jeff Oberholzer knew both victims was more than just a coincidence. 2 months after his wife's death, Jeff took a polygraph test and passed. From day one, Jeff insisted that he had an alibi. He said that at the time of the deaths, he was at home visiting a friend. For nearly 9 years, no one could find this man. Then, in December 1990, he finally surfaced and was questioned about that night. Investigators interviewed the man who claimed that he had been at Jeff's house. However, his time and Jeff's time of the visit didn't match up. Jeff Oberholzer had always maintained his innocence and claimed that the suspect had to be someone that Bobby knew she wouldn't have left with a stranger, especially when he offered to pick Bobby up. For years, the blood found on Bobby's gloves and the tissues with her backpack were believed to be hers. However, in the early 1990s, DNA testing determined that it came from a male. The testing also determined that the blood wasn't Jeff's. As a result of this and other evidences, including several alibi witnesses, Jeff was eventually cleared as a suspect in the case. Police looked into several other suspects as well. One was cab driver Thomas Edward Luther, who in February 1982 picked up a hitchhiker in Breckenridge, then beat and insulted her. While in jail, he allegedly bragged about being responsible for the deaths. According to his girlfriend, he didn't come home on the fateful night. He also lied to investigators and said he was at work at the time. The other suspect, Tracy Petroselli, killed his fiancée in 1981 and went on a multi-state crime spree. During this time, he stayed at Annette's workplace, the Holiday Inn in Frisco. However, neither suspect's DNA matched the evidence from the crime scene. On February 24, 2021, a 70-year-old man named Alan Lee Phillips was arrested and charged with the deaths. He was also charged with kidnapping and assaulting with a deadly weapon. He's currently being held without bail. Genetic genealogy was used to link the DNA found at the crime scene to Phillips. Investigators also suspect that he may be involved in other crimes throughout Colorado. Sadly, Bobby's brother, Kelly, and father Thomas have passed away before finding out who was responsible for taking her life. Next on the list is the case of Gail Barris. On October 9, 1988, Gail Barris was spotted leaving a coffee shop in the early hours of the morning accompanied by a man. This was the last time Barris was ever seen alive. She was a 30-year-old single mother of 3 from Michigan. Life was hard, and she worked at 2 different local bars to be able to survive and take care of the 3 children. In the early hours of October 9, 1988, between 3 and 4 a.m., Barris was spotted leaving Speed's coffee shop in Battle Creek, Michigan. She was accompanied by a dark-haired man, and that was last time anyone saw her alive. On October 25th, hunters from Emmett, a nearby town, made a horrifying discovery. They found a lifeless body of a woman laying on River Road. The authorities quickly identified the body to be that of Gail Barris, and an extensive investigation followed. Witnesses were identified and interviewed, and evidence was collected from the crime scene. On October 22nd, just a few days before Barris's body was discovered and almost 2 weeks after her disappearance, a 24-year-old man named Roger Plato was approached by authorities. Plato's car matched the description from a victim of a different abduction and assault case. At 4:30 p.m., authorities attempted to detain him at gunpoint while he was walking to his car at a parking lot in Bellevue. Plato became aggressive, refused to cooperate, and started fighting back. He was shot when he tried to wrestle the gun from a detective, and as a result, died from the injuries. He was never interviewed. Authorities performed an autopsy and a blood sample was taken before the body was cremated, which was stored at a private lab at the time. Investigators of Barris's case turned their attention to Plato's friend and former roommate, Richard Compton. Compton had a vast criminal career, but when approached by investigators, he backed off and denied knowing anything. With no further leads or developments, Barris's case eventually went cold. In 2018, Battle Creek cold case detective Scott Marshall reopened the case. One of his first discoveries was that Compton's DNA had never been tested, so made Compton his #1 suspect. After some investigation, Detective Marshall discovered that Compton had died in 2009 and his body was buried in the County International Cemetery in Austin, Texas. Compton was just 59 years old when he died. Detective Marshall got a search warrant and traveled to Texas to exhume Compton's body. After examination, it was discovered that Compton's DNA samples didn't match that found in Barris's body, but matched previously unidentified hairs connected to the crime scene. In November 2020, a break in the case emerged, almost by luck. Sergeant Chris Spacek of the Calowan County Sheriff's Department was taking an inventory of evidence at the department and found a vial containing the blood sample taken from Plato. On January 30th, 2021, it was announced that a state police lab connected the blood to DNA found on Gail Barris's body, confirming Plato was responsible for assaulting her and taking her life. It's almost likely that Compton witnessed it happening. Both men have already died and they never had to pay for this horrible crime. However, the Barris family has expressed their relief on finally being able to have some kind of closure. Detective Marshall said DNA technology is the future for solving cold cases. We now come to the case of Stephanie Summers. On August 30th, 1980, Stephanie Summers was supposed to spend the day with her nephew. They were going to celebrate his birthday and spend a wonderful day together. However, she never appeared. Police eventually found her lifeless body inside her apartment. Summers was a 36-year-old woman who lived in Silver Lake, Los Angeles, California. She'd only recently moved there from Newhall, Santa Clarita, and she couldn't be more excited. On that fatal day of August 30th, she was at her apartment getting ready to spend the day with her 11-year-old nephew, Kelly Roberts, from Santa Clarita Valley. She was planning to pick him up and take him to Six Flags Magic Mountain as a late birthday present. Kelly got dressed up especially for the occasion, however. His aunt never turned up. Concerned, her family contacted the authorities who went to check her apartment. That's when they made the grisly discovery. Stephanie's lifeless body was laying inside her apartment. Forensic evidence was collected at the crime scene and an extensive investigation began. Several people were interviewed, however, the leads went nowhere and the case went cold. The case remained unsolved for more than 3 decades until Los Angeles detectives received a fresh lead in 2014. It implicated a man named Harold Anthony Parkinson who lived a mile away from the victim, and he could be a main suspect in the case. On June 19, 2014, a DNA sample collected from Parkinson was consistent with the DNA profile taken from Summers' body, and he was charged with taking her life. However, Parkinson was already in jail serving between 15 years to life at the Chickawa Valley State Prison in Blythe for another unrelated attack. This other attack happened in Los Angeles on April 8, 1981, when he shot a man named Derek Eugene Perry. Perry succumbed to the injuries and died. Parkinson was arrested and began serving time for that sentence on March 5, 1982. Perry's sister Dolly said, "The time, I remember the last meal I had with Derek. It was at a Sizzler restaurant. He gave me a hug and told me he loved me." She described her older sibling as an excellent BMX rider and surfer and a brilliant big brother. The motive of the attack was unknown or undisclosed by authorities. After learning that Parkinson was being accused of Summers' death, Dolly said that he is a dangerous man and should never be allowed back on the streets. In court, Parkinson's lawyer argued that his client had an assault at Summers and claimed that the two were romantically involved and they slept together a few days before she was attacked. Prosecutors, however, said Summers, after a brief marriage to a man, had told friends that she was only attracted to women. Los Angeles court judge Kathleen Kennedy described Summers' case as a very degrading, horrible, and violent crime. Judge Kennedy believed there was proof beyond a reasonable doubt that Parkinson was responsible for this. On February 4, 2021, Harold Anthony Parkinson, who is now 61 years old, was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Our next case is the case of Sylvia May Quayle. On August 4, 1981, William Quayle went to visit his daughter in Cherry Hills Village near Denver, Colorado. She lived just 150 feet from his home. What he discovered was something no parent should ever have to witness. According to her friends, 34-year-old Sylvia May Quayle was ambitious, vibrant, friendly, and lit up the room when she walked in. She loved history and worked as a secretary at an architectural firm. An excellent cook, she also opened up her own business specializing in wedding cakes. Quayle had a lot of friends and was an avid artist. She loved to create pottery, many of which her sister still has in her home 3 decades later. She was extremely close to her family, especially her parents who lived just 150 feet away from her home and had coffee with them every morning. Until that morning, just before 8 a.m. on August 4, 1981, officers were dispatched to Sylvia's house after her father found her lifeless body and called 911. Sylvia Quayle had spoken to her sister on the phone the previous night, around 11 p.m., so investigators knew she'd been killed between the time she hung up the phone that night and when her father got to the house 9 hours later. Her father told the officers he'd arrived to find his daughter lying naked on the living room floor. Investigation revealed that she'd been shot, stabbed multiple times, strangled, assaulted. The autopsy confirmed the loss of blood was ultimately the cause of death. Investigators found 2 important clues at the crime scene. The telephone line in the living room and outside the house had been cut, and the bathroom window screen had been removed and tossed into some tall weeds. About 140 more pieces of evidence were collected from the scene, and over time a variety of technological advances were used on the items as investigators tried to solve the crime. In 1983, 2 years after her death, forensic technicians using an alternate light source found DNA material not from Sylvia in the rug where her body was found laying. The same year brought hope for investigators in the Quayle family after notorious serial killer Otis Irwood Tull confessed to have taken Sylvia's life. Many of Tull's confessions were later known to be false, along those of his companion Henry Lee Lucas. Lucas, who died in a Texas prison in 2001, claimed hundreds of victims. However, authorities were only able to confirm a handful. In 1993, the charges against Tull and Sylvia's death were dropped. At the time, DNA testing on evidence in the case had proven that Tull was not the source of the DNA found at the crime scene 12 years earlier. In 1995, a section of the rug was cut out and submitted to the Colorado Bureau of Investigation to be tested. 5 years later, the sample provided authorities with an unknown male DNA profile. However, no match was found and the case went cold. In January 2020, Cherry Hills Village cold case detectives and investigators decided to use the recent technology of genetic genealogy in Sylvia's case. For months later, a name surfaced: David Dwayne Anderson. At the time of Sylvia's death, Anderson, then 22 years old, lived a couple of miles away from her. Cold case detectives began investigating Anderson. One particular investigator, Robert Fuller, traveled to Cozad, where Anderson now lived, to secretly collect the suspect's DNA. Fuller was able to recover 2 trash bags Anderson had tossed into a dumpster. Inside were 15 items that potentially held Anderson's genetic material. Included among the items was a vanilla Coke can. On January 29, 2021, genetic material taken out of the vanilla Coke can match the ones found in the body and crime scene. When investigators looked into Anderson's past, they found a string of at least 8 home and business burglaries between 1981 and 1986. In one of the home burglaries, he removed and tossed a window screen to gain entrance. Anderson, now 62 years old, was arrested on February 10, 2021. The first photograph is of Anderson in 1980. If anyone recognizes this photograph of him from this time period and has information surrounding or involving this case, we ask that you please call the Cherryville Village Police Department tip line at 720-305-9831. William and Mary Quayle didn't live to see their daughter's killer charged. William died in 1999 and his wife followed 10 years later. Our final case is the case of Bonnie Baker. On the night of June 30th, 1998, Baker was celebrating her recent promotion with some friends. Her boyfriend at the time showed up unexpectedly to the party. After a few tense moments, they both left, and that was the last time she was ever seen alive. Bonnie Baker was a 47-year-old woman from Denver, Colorado, where she shared an apartment with a boyfriend, Crespin Nene Perez. The couple had met at the Fort restaurant in Morrison, where they both worked. Baker was the perfect employee, never calling in sick and always showing up on time. The same couldn't be said about Perez, who had been fired a month earlier for missing work. Baker decided to celebrate her recent promotion with her friends at one of their places in Golden. They planned to spend the night partying. The night quickly turned for the worse after Baker's boyfriend unexpectedly showed up to the friend's place. Perez arrived at the party and almost immediately started to make a scene. He was jealous seeing his girlfriend drinking and dancing with her friends in the living room. Several witnesses at the party later said that Perez looked as if he had taken illicit substances. His eyes were red and glazed, and he was very aggressive. He also continuously eyed everyone off at the party, attempting to instigate a fight with anyone who stared back. Baker's last known words to a friend were, "It would be better if I just go now, or it will be worse." The pair left the party early when the situation became heated. At around 8 p.m. that night, authorities received a phone call from an unidentified woman. She reported that a man had taken a woman's life in an apartment on West Louisiana Avenue. She also claimed that the man was about to drive to Mexico in a red vehicle with Colorado license plates, and the woman's body was in the trunk, which she was planning to dump somewhere along the way. When tracing the call, police found that it was made from a payphone, so they rushed to the address given. In the apartment, there were no signs of a struggle, and no one was found. The next day, Perez's car was involved in a single vehicle collision near Globe, Arizona, but he fled the scene on foot. The car ended up being impounded, and upon examination, blood was collected from the trunk as evidence. The case was shelved, but was reinvestigated a year later due to possible new evidence. On July 31st, 1999, two boys went horseback riding in a remote part of a Navajo reservation in New Mexico. They stumbled across what appeared to be a human skull and immediately contacted authorities. After searching the area, investigators found several more skeletal remains. Despite the find, the results of the autopsy and the reason for the death remained inconclusive. The case went cold due to the lack of evidence and correlation between Baker, the missing person, and the found remains. In October of 2012, cold case detective Kenneth Klaus from Denver was assigned Baker's case and immediately called an FBI agent in New Mexico to discuss her disappearance. DNA samples from the remains found on the Navajo reservation were sent to Denver's crime lab for forensic testing. They matched samples collected from Bonnie Baker on April 4, 2013. The unknown female caller came forward admitting that she was the one who called 911 the night of Baker's disappearance. She also claimed that she cleaned out the couple's apartment after their disappearance and before the authorities arrived, where broken plates and glass covered the floor and the kitchen table was overturned. The unidentified woman also gave a full description of the red vehicle, which was later determined to be a geoprism, as well as its license plate number. And according to the woman, told her that night, "I know that you don't like Bonnie. Something bad happened to us. You'll never have to see Bonnie again because I'm going to make her disappear." This woman's relationship with the couple was not yet revealed by the authorities. Another witness also identified Perez as the driver of the red GEO from a photo lineup. After further rounds of witness interviews and forensic DNA testing, the gathered evidence concluded that there was enough ground to arrest Crespin Nene Perez. A warrant was issued for Perez's arrest, but the arrest couldn't be made as he was now living in Mexico. His extradition to the United States didn't happen until 2020. Prosecutors theorized that Baker's body was likely left in a shallow grave within a day of a disappearance. On January 27, 2021, preliminary reading in the case was held in Denver court, and Perez faces charges for abducting and taking Baker's life. Skidmore, Missouri is the setting of this tragic and disturbing story. In the interest of providing a bit of background, it's worth noting that this small town with a population of less than 400 people already had a big name when it came to crime. It became the center of a media firestorm in the early 1980s. A local man named Ken McElroy had a notorious reputation as a vicious bully. Accused of theft and rape amongst other things, he would often receive light sentences for his crimes. which angered the people of Skidmore. When leaving a local bar in 1981, he was shot dead in broad daylight in a vigilante-style execution. Despite his wife witnessing the murder, the town closed ranks and would not corroborate her version of events. And 20 years later, this refusal to talk and a stalled investigation would thrust Skidmore back into the spotlight once again. Branson Kane Perry was born on February 24, 1981. His parents divorced in late 2000, but he remained the apple of their eye and they adored him. He graduated from Nottoway Holt High School and soon after began working odd jobs around the neighborhood to support himself. He was an active young man and a black belt martial artist. After the divorce of his parents, he lived with his father at 304 West Oak Street in Skidmore. April 7, 2001. Perry visited his neighbor, Jason Bierman, and while he was there, he ended up being inadvertently drugged. While under the influence, he stripped naked and ended up having sex with Bierman. It was known that Branson was gay and had had sexual encounters in the past, but he felt embarrassed and upset and he confided in his father, Bob. Bob knew about his son's sexuality, but he was furious that his son had been taken advantage of. For days later, Branson invited a friend called Gina over to his house. Bob had been in hospital and was due home soon. Branson wanted to have the house tidy for him when he returned. At the same time, two unnamed men were carrying out repair works on Bob's car outside. The events of that day remain unclear. The following is an excerpt taken from a blog post made by Rebecca Clino, Branson's mother. The events of that day are fairly sketchy to me and often make no sense. I don't have a timeline of when they occurred, only sporadic comments that were made. At one point, the friend saw Branson run into the kitchen and take something out of the cabinets, then run out the back door. When he returned, she said he wouldn't tell her what he was doing and acted like nothing had happened. Later, she said she had taken a shower, and when she came out of the bathroom, she saw one of the men that was working on the car going through the cabinets in the kitchen. She said she had asked him what he was looking for. He told her nothing and went back outside. Then at approximately 3 p.m., she'd been upstairs when she heard the front porch door shut. She looked out the window and saw Branson. She asked him where he was going and he told her he was going to put the jumper cables into the storage shed and would be right back. She never saw him again. The men that had been working on the car claimed to have never seen him. No one saw him. When Branson didn't return from outside, Gina says that she believed he had simply gotten sidetracked, so she left his house and went home. The next day, April 12th, Branson's grandmother, Joanne, stopped by the Perry residence. When she got to the house, she realized no one was home and that the door was unlocked. Over the next few days, she continued to call the house but would get no answer. She contacted Branson's mother and they realized that neither had spoken to him. Bob was discharged from hospital a few days later than expected and he and his wife went to report Branson as a missing person on April 17th. County police organized a 15-mile radius search of the area surrounding Branson and Bob's home. They could find no trace of him in the fields or abandoned buildings. Police also couldn't locate the jumper cables he said he was taking to the shed. It wasn't until 2 weeks later that they were found just inside the door. For the following 6 weeks, the police interviewed at least 100 people in Skidmore in an attempt to piece together Branson's movements and generate any new leads. They spoke to his friend Gina, who was one of the last people to see Branson. She told the police that Branson had been experimenting with drugs, namely marijuana and amphetamines. This was confirmed by a member of his family, who said that he had a bottle of Valium with him on the day he disappeared. Following this lead, police began investigating other drug users who were known to Branson, but they all passed polygraph tests when they said they had not seen him. Rumors circulated that Branson was indebted to local drug dealers, but no information surrounding this came to light. Bob's first thought was that he was embarrassed by his encounter with Bierman and as a result had gone to Kansas City to see friends. He also assumed he could have hitchhiked as he didn't have a working car. The investigation into what happened to Branson stalled and nothing new would arise until 2003. On April 10th of that year, a 59-year-old pastor and scout leader called Jack Wayne Rogers was arrested. Allegations ranged from child pornography and assault to practicing medicine without a license after he removed the genitalia of a trans woman in a hotel room. in a botched gender reassignment operation. After being unable to stop her from bleeding, his victim called 911. While investigating him, they uncovered numerous posts he had made on message boards pertaining to the torture and assault of various men. One of these posts stood out to investigators. In it, he claimed to have been flagged down by a blonde male hitchhiking. He described raping, torturing, and mutilating the young man. He also claimed that the victim had been buried in a secluded area of the Ozarks. Police believed that there was a possible connection to Branson. However, Rogers denied seeing him, let alone knowing him. He said all the posts he had made were part of a fantasy and completely made up. The law enforcement were not convinced. They continued searching Rogers and in his car found a turtle claw necklace, which bore a resemblance to one that Branson had owned. In April 2004, Rogers stood trial and was convicted of assault and performing an illegal surgery, for which he received a sentence of 17 years and 7 years respectively. He also received a 30-year sentence for charges relating to child pornography, which would run concurrently. Whilst he was being sentenced, Branson's mother Rebecca begged and pleaded with him for information on her son's whereabouts. He maintained that he did not know Branson and was not involved in his disappearance. Afterwards, Rebecca said she no longer believed Rogers was involved. She said in a statement, "The police are not completely ruling him out, but now the investigation has turned towards Skidmore again. They have received new leads there. I suppose time has a way of unraveling secrets. I believe someone in that area knows what happened to Branson. In my heart, I don't believe this suspect is responsible. Despite the nightmare I lived through at his sentencing, I am thankful that someone with that much evil will never walk the streets again." Sadly, just 3 years after the disappearance of his son, Bob passed away in 2004. The police and Branson's surviving family refused to give up. 8 years after he vanished, the police received what they referred to as a credible tip that Branson's remains could be in Quitman, Missouri. However, this lead, like all others, would go nowhere. To add to the tragedy, after a long fight with cancer, Rebecca Clino, Branson's mother, passed away in 2011. The Q Center for Missing Persons founder Monica Clayson, who was a personal friend of Rebecca, vowed to carry on the search for Branson and not give up hope. Rebecca was buried alongside an empty plot for Branson, which listed his date of death as April 11, 2001, the day he was last seen alive. Branson's case remains open, and the police and family still hope that one day the questions surrounding Branson's disappearance will be answered. If you have any information relating to the disappearance or whereabouts of Branson Perry, please contact the relevant authorities. Moving on to the next case. CCTV often plays a vital role in investigating crimes. It can help piece together events and be a vital witness when there may be no others. In the age of CCTV, it remains a mystery how some people can seemingly vanish without a trace. With cameras picking up at every move, what happens when a CCTV trail goes cold and an investigation hits a brick wall? This is the story of the disappearance of Trevor Deely. On the 15th of August, 1978, Ann and Michael Deely welcomed their 5th child, a little boy named Trevor. He grew up in County Kildare and soon became an extremely intelligent and career-driven young man. He developed an aptitude for business and technology, and by his early 20s had landed a job in the IT department of the Bank of Ireland Asset Management team. The work Christmas party was scheduled for the December 7, 2000. Drinking began at Copperface Jack's and the Hilton before it carried on to Buck Whaley's nightclub on Lower Leeson Street. 22-year-old Trevor left Buck Whaley's around 3:30 a.m. He walked in the direction of the Renoir complex where he had an apartment on Serpentine Avenue. Around 10 minutes after leaving Buck Whaley's, Trevor arrived at his office and security let him in. He made a cup of tea and spoke to his colleague, Carl, who was on the night shift. Trevor checked his emails and made a schedule of what needed to be done the following day. Due to a heavy storm and a taxi strike, he left at 4:03 a.m. with his umbrella in hand and carried on foot. He rang a friend of his in County Kildare and the friend described the voicemail as, "Hi Glenn, I missed you there. Just on my way home, all going good. I'll talk to you tomorrow." The message was regarded as innocuous by his friend and it was deleted. CCTV footage from the bank showed a man dressed in black that was waiting outside for around 30 minutes before Trevor appeared. When he got there, Trevor and the man engaged in brief conversation, but by the time Trevor left the bank, the man in black had gone. At 4:14 a.m., CCTV captured Trevor walking past what was the AIB Bank on the corner of Bagot Street Bridge and Haddington Road, heading towards his apartment. Around 30 seconds later, a man in black takes the same route. The Gardaí believed that this is the same man that was stood outside the bank and spoke to Trevor. This footage of him at 4:14 a.m. is the last known sighting of him. Due to the heavy partying the night before, Trevor's failure to turn up at work was not considered unusual. His flatmates were away that weekend and did not know he was missing. When Trevor failed to show up on Monday, the alarm was raised. The bank called his family, and after confirming that no one had spoken with him that weekend, he was reported as a missing person. The family's take charge approach drew praise from the Gardaí. Detective Sergeant Michael Fitzgerald, who worked the case from the beginning, said, "His friends and family handed out thousands of leaflets when knocking on doors and put posters up all over Dublin. However, due to the days that had passed from his last known sighting to him being reported missing, vital time and clues had been lost." In the weeks before his disappearance, Trevor had flown to Alaska to meet a girl that he had befriended while she was holidaying in Dublin. Two Gardaí traveled out to Alaska to talk to her, but this proved to be another dead end. The Garda Sabaqua team scoured the River Dodder and the Grand Canal, but turned up nothing. Trevor's sister Michelle said that she called his phone a few times over the weekend he went missing, and she believes that it rang out. Dr. Philip Perry, a senior research fellow in Radio and Optical Communications Laboratory at Dublin City University, said that had Trevor's phone gone into the water, it would have died within seconds. Has since stated that she is not 100% sure it rang. After 16 years and still no trace, the investigation was reopened in December of 2016. In April 2017, the CCTV footage was enhanced and released to the public. The Gardaí said they believe that the man seen following Trevor was the same man from outside the bank. He remains a person of interest, and to date, no one has come forward. In August that same year, the Guardia began searching a secluded area stretching 3 acres of a Dublin suburb, around 5 miles from where Trevor had been seen on the CCTV footage. They had received a tip that Trevor had been murdered that night by a criminal from Crumlin, County Antrim, a criminal that was well known to the Guardia. He was involved in a prostitution and drug gang who operated in the area that Trevor was last seen. The gang had also been investigated in June 1998 for the murder of Sinead Kelly, a young prostitute who'd been stabbed to death on Grand Canal Bank. The informant said that Trevor had crossed paths with his murderer by chance, and it was simply a case of wrong place, wrong time. By September, the search had been called off. Trevor's case remains open and as yet unsolved. If you have any information relating to the disappearance or whereabouts of Trevor Deely, please contact the relevant authorities. Moving on to the next case. The disappearance of Marilyn Bergeron captivated Canada. Born in Quebec in 1983, she was a bright and gifted child with a love for the arts, music, and languages. Her open and inquisitive nature meant she was fascinated by different cultures and ways of life. Her parents described friends that could be a bad influence, and she could sometimes find herself in trouble due to her recklessness. Her passion for the arts meant she graduated with a degree in media arts and technology, and she would eventually move to Montreal in 2005. She was able to use her degree by working as a freelance editor for local stations and worked as a sales assistant in a music store. Her ultimate dream was to become a flight attendant, a job that would show her the world and everything it had to offer. However, this bright and happy young woman would soon become a frightened and paranoid one. In early 2008, she told her family she wanted to return to Quebec City, as she was too frightened and didn't feel safe being in Montreal. February 10, 2010, Marilyn leaves her apartment in Hochelaga, Maisonneuve suddenly, and by the 16th of February, she's moved back home to Quebec City to be with her parents. It became clear to her family that something was deeply wrong. She appeared withdrawn and troubled. Her sister Natalie said that when questioned, Marilyn would refuse to talk and break down in tears. Marilyn denied it was financial woes, drug misuse, or relationship problems. Her mother persisted and asked if someone had assaulted her. When Marilyn went silent, she began to cry. Her mother begged her to seek the help of a psychologist and lift the emotional load that she had been carrying for so long. The day after settling back in with her family, on February 17, 2010, she told her parents she wanted to go for a walk. She wore her black coat and suede boots, took her credit card, and left. At around 11 a.m., she was spotted on CCTV trying to withdraw $60 from an ATM in Loretteville, but her card was declined. The footage shows her repeatedly looking over her shoulder as if on the lookout for something or someone. That afternoon, she went to a coffee shop, Cafe Depot, and paid using her card. The clerk said that she appeared agitated and eager to leave. When Marilyn didn't come home that night, her parents knew something was desperately wrong, and they reported her as a missing person to the police. Investigators traced her card to the ATM and coffee shop, and her parents scoured the city, handing out flyers in a desperate attempt to find their daughter. The story of her disappearance quickly became front-page news. Images of her circulated through different media circuits, and the investigation ramped up. When the police discovered the CCTV of the withdrawn and anxious Marilyn, they initially would not show her parents. They were concerned it would cause them too much unnecessary distress. When her parents eventually watched the footage back, they agreed that she looked helpless. Famed crime reporter Claude Poirier examined the case as part of his TV show Poirier Enquête. When standing at the same ATM, he theorized that she could have been looking at a parked car on the street, which would have been in her line of vision. Further credence is added to this argument when considering that it was a 16-mile trip from her parents' house to the coffee shop. While it was feasible that she walked as she was fit and healthy, her family argue it was more reasonable that she was driven by someone, but to date no one has come forward saying they gave her a lift. The trail quickly went cold and all leads were dead ends. It would be 2 years before any kind of breakthrough. A man got in contact with Claude Poirier saying that Marilyn was in Hawkesbury, Ontario, and that he'd seen her there consistently in the area for over a year. Other locals confirmed this after seeing a photograph of her. They agreed that she had been living there with a man. Marilyn's family became frustrated with the lack of progress surrounding her disappearance. The police had not considered foul play and were treating it as a disappearance and possible suicide. Her family continued making requests to have the Sûreté de Québec, the SQ, or the Montreal police examine her case. The SQ can investigate across the province and had a formidable reputation, and the Montreal police can investigate in the city from which she fled. The requests of the family to have either force take over her case were rejected, and the family expressed their frustration at a press conference in February 2017. The Quebec City Police responded to the criticism, saying they take the case seriously and have done all they can to keep the family informed with the investigation. The SQ said the spokesperson, "In this case, wherever required, the Sûreté de Québec offered its full cooperation and support to the Quebec City Police Service." The reward to find their daughter was increased to $30,000 Canadian dollars. Their lawyer, former Justice Minister for the province, Marc Bellemare, expressed disappointment with investigators for refusing to hand over to either the SQ or the Montreal police. He also announced that a tip line had been set up in order to gather any possible leads on Marilyn's whereabouts. The family held another press conference in November that year, where they announced that 43 sightings had been reported to the tip line. Jonathan Gaultier, who had known Marilyn in college, had reconnected with her in 2007 while she was still in Montreal. He spoke with journalists on the 10th of December. He explained that she had become increasingly fearful and reclusive in the 2 months before her disappearance. He said that when he and Marilyn were going to the same party, he was shocked by the sudden change in Marilyn's personality. She was no longer the inquisitive and positive young woman she once was. Instead, she was despondent and listened to her music in the dark. When they got to the party, her mood slightly improved. But after talking with a friend, she quickly became frightened and anxious, as if she'd been reminded of something she wanted to forget. She quickly asked to go home. When they returned to her apartment, her demeanor deteriorated rapidly and she began to cry uncontrollably. Jonathan tried to comfort her, to get her to explain what had happened. He asked if she had been raped or witnessed a murder. She said no, something much worse had happened. He continued to ask her what it was, but she would not say anymore. She said to him, "You can't even begin to imagine what I've been through, Joe." He is quoted as saying, "I tried to get her to say what it was for 3 or 4 hours. I got the impression she did not want to put me in danger."